Today we're going to continue our discussion of our unit on nomenclature. We're going to talk about naming type 3 compounds which contain two nonmetals. So there are a few rules for naming type 3 compounds. The first element in the formula is named first, and you just use the full element name. Now, unlike type 1 and 2, which contained a metal and a nonmetal, type 3 contains two nonmetals. So technically they are both anions, and so it doesn't really matter which one goes first. There's a certain order, but it isn't like type 1 and type 2. The second element is named as though it was an anion, so we're going to, as in type 1 and type 2, so we're going to give it an IDE ending. Now the difference with type 3 is that because they are both technically anions, we're going to use prefixes to denote the quantity. Okay, now think back to type 2 with transition metals. We used Roman numerals to indicate charge. Here we're using prefixes to indicate quantity. Okay, so try to keep those straight because that's going to really help. The only change here is that the prefix mono is never used for naming the first element. So if there's only one of the first element, we just give the element name. We don't use the prefix mono. Otherwise, it's used in all other purposes. So for example, CO is carbon monoxide, not monocarbon monoxide. So there is one of the second element, and so we use the prefix, but because there's one of the first element, it's just the element name. We can also take out some extra vowels so the names don't sound weird, so tetroxide versus tetraoxide, but that's not a huge deal and you wouldn't be marked off for it. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, so we said that we're using prefixes. So just like knowing the Roman numerals, you're going to need to know prefixes. Probably knowing up to 10 is really helpful. Knowing up to 6 or 7 is probably going to be good, but knowing up to 10 is going to make things a lot more helpful. And this is also in your book if you need this chart. So let's look at some examples. Okay, so we have BF3. Well, we know that all of these are supposed to be nonmetals, but this is what you should be checking for if you're not sure what type the compound is. And so we have boron, which is a nonmetal, and fluorine, which is a nonmetal, so we know this is a type 3. That means we're going to need to use prefixes. So there's one of the first element, and I know if there's one of the first one, I don't use the prefix mono, so I'm just going to put boron. Now for fluorine, there are 3 of them. Well, I know the prefix for 3 is tri. And I'm also going to change the ending on fluorine to IDE, just like in type 1 and type 2. So this becomes boron trifluoride. And that's it. Type 3 are probably the simplest type to name. Okay, let's look at the next one. We've got nitrogen and oxygen. And so first of all, let's check. And yep, they are both nonmetals, so I know I'm going to use prefixes to indicate quantity. There's one nitrogen, but I don't use the mono for the first one, so it's just going to be nitrogen. And then there is one of the second one also, so I need mono. And then oxygen becomes oxide. So this is where we talked about the extra vowels. Normally I'd have mono and then oxide, but I'm just going to put 1. So we have nitrogen monoxide. Okay, N2O5. Well, this is still nitrogen, but now I have 2 of them. Well, the prefix for 2 is di. So I have dinitrogen, because I'm still writing the full element name for the first one. I'm just putting the prefix on it. And then, excuse me. I know 5 is penta, and so O is oxygen, so it's pentoxide. And this is where we're kind of taking out that extra vowel. Let's go the other direction. So now we're going to take the name and write the compound. So first we have carbon. Well, it's the first one, and there's no prefix, so I'm going to assume that there's just one of them. And then we have tetrachloride. Well, tetra is 4. And if you have a hard time remembering this one, I always think of Tetris, that game, and it always has 4 blocks, and they're in different shapes. So tetrachloride, so I know chlorine is Cl, and tetra is 4, so there's 4 chlorines and 1 carbon. Nitrogen dioxide. Okay, again, no prefix on the first one, so I know that there's to be 1. Di means 2, oxide is oxygen, so NO2. And the nice thing with type 3s is that you don't have to check the charges, because they're both anions. The charges are a little different here, and so you have to check charges with type 1 and 2, but type 3, you don't have to worry about it. Alright, so our last example is diiodine heptoxide. Well, this looks like iodine, so di means 2, so iodine, 2 of them. Hept oxide, well, hept is 7, oxide is oxygen, so O7. So I2O7. Okay, so these I think are really simple and should be okay for you to name. Let's kind of combine what we've talked about so far. So looking at type 1, type 2, and type 3. If you're trying to name these and they're all jumbled together, there are a couple questions you can ask yourself to kind of organize your thoughts. So the first question is, does the compound contain a metal? Okay, and you could either say no, or you could say yes. If your answer is yes, that means it's either a type 1 or a type 2. So now we have to determine if the metal is a transition metal. So is the metal a transition? Okay, and we can either answer yes to this, or we can say no. If we say yes, that means that this is a type 2 compound, and we need to use Roman numerals to indicate charge. If your answer is no, that means that this is a type 1, and we name it using the cation name and then the anion with an IDE ending. Okay, what if initially we said that no, it did not contain a metal? Well, then this, given the information we have so far, means that it is a type 3, which is 2 nonmetals, and that means that we're going to use prefixes to indicate quantity. Whoops. Okay, so hopefully this kind of helps you when you're naming combinations of, when they're all combined together.